everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. Today I'm going to provide a broad overview of the contents of this report, while Antonio is going to delve into some of the more specific legal issues. So first I'd like to talk about what we actually mean here by street management. So recently the Development Bureau has produced the Hong Kong 2030 territorial development strategy, and it set out some major goals to foster a walkable, bicycle-friendly city and to enhance the uniqueness, diversity, and vibrancy of Hong Kong's streets and districts. And the way that we manage all these conflicts and these different activities actually makes a big difference to the quality of our walking experience. So what I'm talking today about is the management of activities. So in fact, our government has in the past had a policy of pedestrianizing streets that started in the early 2000s. But as you can see from this graph, after 2 or 3 years, the number of meters of road that were pedestrianized per year very steeply dropped off. And in fact, in 2013-14, it was rolled back some because the Yaozhimong District Council voted to curtail the hours of the pedestrianization scheme there due to all the problems with street management that were not able to be resolved. In fact, looking into the records, we found that by around 2007, there were accounts of district councils opposing proposals to extend or to make permanent pedestrianization scheme in their districts because of all these concerns about street management. So what do I mean by activities on the street besides walking? We've divided them into 6 broad categories, which you can see here on the screen. Political activities include protests as well as electioneering activities by legislative and district councilors. There are charitable fundraising activities, both authorized and unauthorized ones. The unauthorized ones we commonly call begging. Servicing is basically all of the logistical activities that are needed to support buildings. So that's the delivery of goods into buildings and the removal of waste out of it, which all has to take place on the street. Shopfront extension is the practice by which businesses extend their working area or their merchandise displays onto the pavement outside because shop rents are so high in Hong Kong. Itinerant commercial activities covers both hawking and some other unofficial or commercial promotion activities on the street, which are very common. And finally, artistic and recreational activities, which doesn't need to be explained. So in our report, we identify the major problems with street management in Hong Kong. And the overarching issue is that we have a legacy of many different piecemeal policies and pieces of legislation and regulation that were developed over basically a century. And as a result, they don't really necessarily fit together very well. And so we've categorized the issues into these main 5 problems. Silos is a common thing that you hear about in Hong Kong. So what happens is that there are, according to our research, at least 9 different government departments responsible for different aspects of street management. There are actually just 4 main ones, and these are the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department, the Police, Lands Department, and the Home Affairs Department, which plays a coordinating role between other departments. But due to all of these different overlapping jurisdictions, when there has to be cooperation between different departments to get things done, that can be very complicated. There can be disputes over who's responsible for what, and it's a lot of work to coordinate. Second issue, misaligned priorities. So basically, the main focus of our street management thus far is on hawker control, and this comes out of the 1970s when the government put a large emphasis on basically taking hawkers off the street and putting them into enclosed markets. Our regulatory structure, our manpower, our resources are still very heavily dedicated to hawker control, but the situation has changed since 40 years ago. Hawking is actually very well controlled now, and in fact, out of all the people I interviewed, not a single one thought that hawking was a problem in their district. And I'm talking to district councilors and other people who have experience on the ground. The community attitude towards hawking has also changed. The community is more supportive of hawking now. They see it as a part of Hong Kong's cultural heritage. It's an important part of our tourist economy. But our regulatory focus has not moved on since then, and now there are other types of commercial activities happening on streets where there is not enough focus on those ones now, and so basically we're directing our resources at an outdated problem. Inconsistent policies to foster vibrancy. Well, what I mean by this is that because we have so many different rules and regulations that all tackle one individual thing individually, this ends up in a lot of inconsistencies where similar activities are actually treated differently by the law, and this leads to people complaining that they're being treated unfairly. And because it was so piecemeal, there's no real overall vision on how we want our streets to be and what activities we should encourage or which activities we should discourage. There's really no underlying logic there. A lot of laws have become outdated because the situation has changed, but the laws haven't. And this leads to our enforcement agencies having to work with some very inefficient and outdated tools, which I'll talk about a little later. And finally, we have a lot of inefficient processes and procedures, bureaucratic red tape, where it is difficult and time-consuming to both get approval to do things on the street and for the government to enforce against things that shouldn't be happening. So both of these sides are quite slow sometimes. So I'm going to share some anecdotes. Because all these problems I described earlier can lead to some pretty strange and funny situations. So I'll talk about some of these bureaucratic silos. So in 2016, the government changed the law and introduced a fixed penalty fine of $1,500 for shop front extension to discourage shop owners from putting their goods out on the street and blocking pavements. What this resulted in this neighborhood, is that because the shop owners would be fined for putting things out on the street here, they moved them onto trolleys and into vans and put them in the road instead. And basically, the fine can only be used if the situation is completely unambiguous. There's no dispute about whose merchandise that is, or that it's being sold, or that you are using the space. So FEHD will not fine them if the merchandise is in the road because they claim, well, it's stuff that's in transit. We're not blocking the street, we're just moving things. The police also have the right to enforce this law. However, they generally don't intervene unless they're seriously blocking the entire road and causing danger to traffic or public safety, because the police are not particularly concerned about minor things like this. They think, well, this is a street hygiene problem. It's not a safety problem. It's not a public order problem. It's not a crime problem. Therefore, they don't intervene. Even within FEHD, there are silos. There are two main teams that are responsible for street enforcement against these kinds of shop and extensions. One is the hawker control team. The other is the street cleansing team. The hawker control team, because their job is hawker control, they often will not deal with street obstructions that don't involve merchandise. So if there's other stuff like barrels and trolleys or, used appliances that are not being sold, then they say, well, that's not our job. Street cleansing team, their job is to clean the street. And when they show up, they cannot enforce the actual $1,500 fine. They're not empowered to do this. What they can do is say, you're blocking our street cleaning, please get the stuff out of the way. And then if you don't cooperate, then we'll fine you under a separate piece of legislation. But usually it's just, okay, they move it away, they clean the street, and then they put it back. And they can't do anything else. So even silos within the same department. So, inefficient procedures. Let me talk about some of these. Okay, so if you have goods on the street, FEHD will fine you. However, these sorts of extended platforms that people place in front of streets to extend their space, that's not FEHD's job, that's land departments for illegal occupation of government land. And when you have to do that, the land department has to stick a notice on it saying you need to move this thing within 24 to 48 hours, otherwise we'll fine you. So what usually happens is they take it away. 2 days later, lands department comes back, sees it's gone, they leave, and then they put it back out in the street again. Lands department comes back and they have to take another notice, again, another 48-hour warning period. This can happen infinite times. So as a result, like large objects like construction skips, they're using the same mechanism to deal with it. Any kind of unattended object that occupies government land is dealt with in the same way. It's very inefficient. Some of our outdated laws. So, a major problem that everyone's concerned about is the noise created by street performers and karaoke singers and other kinds of musicians on the street, especially in Mongkok. So, one major issue with this is that under the Summary Offences Ordinance, you need to get police permission to play musical instruments on the street. It doesn't say anything about amplifiers. This law is from 1964, before amplification was very widespread or affordable. So it doesn't say anything about that. The Summary Offences Ordinance requirement for police permission is not enforced any longer due to court cases supporting the right for freedom of expression, but then that leaves sort of basically very few tools to control the noise levels. There is the noise control ordinance, but what usually happens is they take this guy to court and he says, well, you can't prove it was my noise that caused all the complaints because there were 10 other musicians on the street. Why don't you go find them? Case dismissed, and he goes. And finally, our definition of hawking is outdated. It's only considered hawking if you're exchanging directly goods or personal services for cash. So these sorts of sales activities, they're selling services, but they're services provided by a third party, and these guys do not take your money right away. They take your credit card details down. So they can say, this is not a sale. We're just registering customer information. We are not hawkers. You cannot regulate us. Our laws just haven't caught up with the changing situation. So our recommendations. There's a need for joined-up government and more coordination and coherent thinking about street management. One of our major recommendations is to appoint someone called a City Betterment Commissioner, who would be a person at a high level in government who's responsible for coordinating all the different bureaus and departments, because there's so many involved, to create a coherent policy on street management, but also other issues to do with the quality of our public realm. We want fair policies to encourage activities that are desirable on the street. And there are a lot of different inconsistencies in the ways hawkers and promoters are treated, like I mentioned earlier, as well as shops and restaurants. Restaurants can apply to put tables outside. There is no such mechanism for shops. And the shopkeepers say, well, why can restaurants do it, but I can't? I get a fine, and these guys get to pay $10 a year to have their furniture outside. Another huge loophole in our laws is the lack of licensing or registration for street performers and commercial promoters. And we think that it's time for the government to think about seriously implementing a licensing system. The benefits of this would be legitimizing the street performers so that they're not considered beggars. It would give mechanisms to control the noise levels and where and when street performers perform. And for the commercial promoters, it would basically enable better control over where they set up and the amount of space that they use, so they don't obstruct public space. There's a need to review outdated laws, as I explained earlier. And finally, a major part of our recommendation is that there is a need for the government to do public engagement on a district-to-district level. to engage different stakeholders to find out what local preferences and needs are, because different districts might want different things. And so we're advocating that more flexibility in government, in the district administration system, as well as within government departments, to encourage local experimentation and to adopt local solutions. Right now, there is not a whole lot of flexibility. There's some, but the emphasis is on uniformity across all districts, and we don't think that this is particularly appropriate if the district character itself is so different. One more comprehensive solution we think the government can consider is to pass a management of pedestrian zones ordinance, where you can designate certain streets as a pedestrian zone and then have legislation for the management of that space. This is modeled on New York City. They did this in Times Square because they had so many problems with aggressive street performers bothering the tourists for tips. And so what they did was they passed a piece of legislation to define it as a pedestrian plaza, which enabled the Department of Transportation to zone different areas in the Times Square for different activities. So you can have street performers here, and here all you can do is basically pedestrian circulation. So you keep an area clear for people to walk. We think that such a body could do other things like coordinating deliveries and waste removal between the businesses, establish rules for behavior, and basically put it under more unified management. There are debates over who the management body should be, but I won't get into that right now. So our overall objectives for street management policy, which I think the government should think about at a high level, is to think about how to foster managed vibrancy. And what I mean by this is you want to allow and encourage activities that are vibrant and creative. We don't want to shut down everything so that there's no street life and everything is boring and clean. But we want policies that encourage responsible street usage and to keep nuisances to a manageable level. We think that these policies will do a lot to enhance the quality of life in Hong Kong and to create a safe, interesting, and comfortable walking experience. Right now I'm going to hand over to Antonio, who will talk more about the legal issues involved.
Thank you, Corinne.